All right, so we're diving into some pretty toasty news today, huh? Lots of reports and some, honestly, kind of scary pictures of RTX 5090s having some serious power connector issues.
Yeah, I can see why people are spooked. Not exactly widespread yet, but the early signs. They definitely make you think. That image, the one with the melted connector and PSU, well, it's a real wake-up call.
I'll say, giving me major deja vu, by the way. Feels like we just did this whole song and dance with the RTX 4090 a couple years back, didn't we? Like, haven't we learned anything?
It does seem like we're seeing some familiar problems cropping up again. And one thing that jumps out right away from these reports, it's those Modi DIY adapters being mentioned again.
Hmm.
They were they were kind of notorious during the 4090 meltdowns too.
No kidding. So these Modi DIY cables, they've got a bit of a fiery past. So if I'm rocking one of those, maybe swap it out like yesterday.
Yeah, probably a good idea. I mean, given their track record, I'd say steer clear of those Modi DIY adapters entirely. Stick with the official Nvidia one. Much safer bet.
Gotcha. But it's not just the cables themselves, right?
Yeah.
Some of these reports, they mention damage on the power supply side too. So even if I'm using the official Nvidia adapter, my PSU could still be at risk.
Yeah, and that's something to really pay attention to. The sources seem to suggest that some power supplies, maybe they've got some compatibility issues or just aren't quite up to snuff in terms of quality.
So this is like a double whammy of making sure you've got a top-notch power supply that can handle the RTX 5090's was it power hunger.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about the wattage either. You got to make sure your PSU is designed for those specific power delivery needs.
Yeah.
Especially with that 12V HPWR or the 12V2x6 connector.
It's wild to me that, I mean, NVIDIA went and redesigned the connector, right?
Yeah.
From that 12V HPWR to the 12V 2x6, and we're still seeing these issues. Was the redesign not, like, effective?
Well, the idea was to make the new design tougher, right? They shortened the sensing pins and gave it longer conductor terminals, which on paper should make it more reliable, but seems like it's still vulnerable to, user error. And then there's those potential PSU problems we talked about.
Remember when the 4090 was melting down? NVIDIA was pointing fingers at users, saying they weren't plugging in the connectors all the way. But some of these new reports, they show melting even when the connection looks solid. So what's the deal there?
I mean, there's no doubt that user error was a factor in some of those 4090 cases. But these new reports, they kind of point to something else going on, probably bad continuity.
Continuity. Okay, so like, is that something I should be checking for myself?
Think of it like this. Imagine electricity flowing through a wire is kind of like water going through a hose, right? If the hose gets kinked, that's bad continuity, it creates resistance, and the water has a hard time getting through, that builds up pressure, and eventually that hose could burst. Same idea here. High resistance in the power cable can make things heat up real fast, and that can lead to melting, or even worse, a fire.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. So basically, bad continuity means there's resistance in the connection, and that's what's causing all this heat.
Exactly. And according to the sources, it looks like bad continuity is a major suspect in these RTX 5090 meltdowns.
Especially since we're talking some serious wattage here. That RTX 5090, it's pulling up to 575 watts through a cable rated for 600. Seems like, I don't know, kind of pushing it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a valid concern for sure. Running that close to the limit, there's not a lot of room for error. Even a small problem can become a big fiery mess when you're dealing with that much power. Any resistance at all, and things can go south real quick.
Interesting thing is, AMD is sticking with those older 8-pin connectors for their new cards. One source even mentioned they called the 12V HPWR connector a fire hazard last year. Does that, I don't know, kind of add fuel to the fire, so to speak?
Definitely raises some eyebrows. I mean, sure, AMD's got a horse in the race, but their engineers aren't exactly slouches either. The fact they're steering clear of that 12V HPWR connector altogether, well, it kind of makes you wonder if maybe pushing the power limits this far is the right move.
Oh.
It does make you think, about where all this is headed. I mean, these GPUs are only going to get more power hungry, right? So what happens then?
Right. All right, so let's get practical here. What can our listeners do to, I don't know, avoid a meltdown of their own?
Yeah.
If you just shelled out the big bucks for an RTX 5090, what are the key takeaways?
First things first, use that official NVIDIA adapter. No cutting corners with third-party cables, especially like we talked about, anything Modi DIY. Just not worth the risk, seriously.
Official adapter, check. What else?
Got to double check that power supply. Make sure it's a good one. One that's built to handle the 5090's, appetite for power. And that means it can handle that 12V HPWR or the 12V 2x6 connector.
So don't just assume any old PSU will do the trick.
Exactly. Even if you've got a PSU that's technically compatible, take a minute to really look over all the connections,
Yeah.
Make sure everything's plugged in all the way, nice and snug, and keep an eye out for anything that looks, I don't know, overheated or damaged.
Like what kind of stuff? Discoloration or like actual melting or
Yeah.
that kind of smoky smell?
Yep, all of that. Anything seems fishy, shut the whole system down right away. Don't even think about turning it back on until you figure out what's going on.
And I'm guessing staying up to date on like official stuff from Nvidia or the PSU manufacturers, that's probably a good idea too, right?
Oh, absolutely. This whole thing's still unfolding. Could be recalls, maybe firmware updates, who knows?
Man, this whole situation, it just feels kind of, I don't know, sketchy. Shouldn't we be able to trust that these parts are safe to use, right out of the box?
Yeah, I get that. It just goes to show why it's so important to, do your homework and be proactive about your hardware. We're talking bleeding edge stuff here, and sometimes, yeah, you get these hiccups after launch.
So it's not necessarily like someone messed up or the design is just bad, but more like we're pushing the limits of what's possible and these things happen.
Right. And to be fair to NVIDIA, they did try to, make things better with that 12V 2x6 design. But there's just so many factors at play here. User error, the power supply, manufacturing tolerances. It's like impossible to catch everything,
But the fact that it's happening again, it does make you wonder if it's a bigger problem, right? Like, are we just pushing too hard, too fast when it comes to power?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we all want more performance, and that takes more power. There's no getting around that. But at what cost, right? We can't just chuck safety and reliability out the window just to squeeze out a few more frames per second.
It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. Like, we're still figuring out how to get all that juice to these power-hungry cards without, setting everything on fire.
Maybe this is just part of the process, right? Growing pains of a new tech that'll eventually get ironed out. Or maybe it's a sign that we need to rethink this whole power delivery thing from the ground up. Only time will tell, I guess.
Well, one thing's for sure, we'll be watching this whole situation closely. And for everyone listening, stay safe, stay informed, and maybe give those power connections an extra once-over, just in case.
Couldn't hurt, right? Always better to be safe than sorry, especially with something as, well, potentially electrifying as this.
Speaking of electrifying, you sent over some stuff about how AMD is handling power in their new cards, and it seems like they're going a different route. Sticking with those older 8-pin connectors and even call the 12VHPWR a fire hazard last year? What's your take on that?
Yeah, AMD going with the 8-pin, it's definitely interesting. I mean, they're not exactly shy about pointing out potential issues with Nvidia, right? But they're engineers, they know what they're doing. So the fact they're avoiding that 12VHPWR connector like the plague, it does make you think, maybe they know something we don't.
So it's not just like marketing BS. They genuinely think there are safety risks with this thing.
Seems that way. And when you consider these reports we've been talking about, the melting, and the fact that that 12VHPWR connector is really pushing the limits of what those cables can handle, well, it makes sense why AMD might be a little hesitant, right?
So you wonder if maybe, this whole obsession with more and more power, maybe it's starting to backfire a little.
It's a good point. The industry needs to find that sweet spot, where you can push performance without putting people's hardware and maybe even their safety at risk.
Well, this has been a wild ride, hasn't it? Fascinating stuff, but also a little unsettling, to say the least, this whole world of high-powered GPUs and all the challenges that come with it. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I think the biggest thing is just be aware, Do your research, choose your parts carefully, and don't be afraid to ask questions if something doesn't seem right.
So knowledge is power, huh?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to keeping your rig from going up in smoke.
Exactly. And remember, things are still developing, so keep an eye out for updates, from Nvidia, PSU makers, all that.
Okay, so we got the official Nvidia adapter, a good power supply, and we're staying tuned for any news or updates, anything else folks can do to, stay on the safe side.
Don't be afraid to actually get in there and look around, check those connections every now and then. A little bit of preventative maintenance can save you a lot of headaches later on.
So visually, right? Looking for discoloration, melting, anything that looks out of place.
Yeah, exactly. And don't forget about your nose either. If you smell something burning, like plastic, or if things are getting way too hot, well, that's a pretty clear sign something's not right. Shut it down right away and investigate.
Sounds like a good rule of thumb is if you're not sure, just shut it down. Better safe than sorry, right? Especially with all this power flowing around.
Absolutely. And remember, this isn't just about, saving your hardware. It's about your own safety too. Electricity, it's not something to mess around with.
Right, good point. Well, this has been pretty eye-opening, It's amazing how something is, I don't know, seemingly simple as a power connector can create such a complex mess.
It just goes to show, even with all this fancy tech, you can't escape the laws of physics, right?
And sometimes pushing those limits, well, it comes with a price. Appreciate you walking us through all this. I know I learned a lot, and hopefully everyone listening did too.
My pleasure. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe out there, everyone.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, happy gaming, and may all your power connections stay cool and connected.